January 1942. The temperature has fallen so far below zero that breath freezes inside wool scarves before it escapes into the air. In a half-burned village south of Leningrad, a German infantry division has stopped moving, not because of artillery, not because of Soviet resistance, but because men are collapsing where they stand. Inside frozen huts and dugouts, boots are lined neatly near doors that will not open again. The hospital tent reeks not of blood, but of rot. Latrine pits have filled, frozen, overflowed. Snow is scooped into bare hands where paper should be. Some men burn maps and letters for warmth, others for cleanliness. Silence hangs heavier than gunfire. Officers whisper about an enemy no rifle can stop. It works through the gut, through fevered skin, through shame. A division that crossed borders with flags and marching songs now shivers in filth and hunger, immobilized by something so small it was never counted and so powerful it cannot be stopped. What crippled them did not fire a shot. It was absence. And it would change everything. In the summer of 1941, when German armor cut through the plains of Eastern Europe and deep into Soviet territory, the war still wore the mask of certainty. Operation Barbarossa had been conceived as a lightning campaign of violent, swift decapitation of the Soviet state that would break resistance before winter even arrived. German planners did not imagine protracted trench warfare. They expected collapse, encirclement, surrender. The Wehrmacht advanced with speed unmatched in modern history, but speed created a shadow, a logistical void stretching hundreds of kilometers behind the front. Rail lines lay torn apart. Roads turned to mud, then to ice. Fuel often arrived late or not at all. Winter uniforms were missing from stockpiles. Ammunition rotted in unheated depots. And in the margin of every supply manifest, beneath rifles and shells and rations, Hygiene sat quietly listed soap, bandages, disinfectant, paper. It seemed small. Almost decorative. A luxury for peacetime armies. German doctrine had always placed logistics at the heart of warfare, yet even the most detailed plans had limits. The army moved faster than the trains that followed it. Under General Eduard Wagner of the Quartermaster General's office, the logistical apparatus was designed for rapid victory, not survival in hostile terrain for months on end. Fuel and ammunition were prioritized. Medical supplies were cut. Paper from medical linen to latrine use came last. By late 1941, German rail distribution had begun to collapse. Entire divisions were sustained on emergency reserves not designed to last beyond weeks. A soldier could receive bullets without bandages, food without salt, boots without socks. And latrine supplies were considered a non-essential. In Germany itself, paper was already becoming scarce. British naval blockades and Allied bombing raids disrupted supply chains across the Reich. The paper industry had been redirected toward military documentation, propaganda, and cartography. Newspapers were reduced in size and print runs. Civilian rationing cut household paper access to almost nothing. At the front, this scarcity crystallized into invisibility. There were no requisitions for toilet paper as such. There were bundles of coarse field paper issued in tiny quantities, but they disappeared quickly in units serving thousands of men. What replaced them were torn pages from forgotten books, ration wrappers, snow, frozen leaves, rags, or nothing at all. On the Eastern Front, sanitation had never been easy. Ill-prepared infrastructure, scorched earth withdrawal, and destroyed villages forced German troops to dig makeshift latrines in frozen ground, often too shallow or too near living quarters. Waste froze solid by night, thawed by day, and bled through the soil. Field manuals warned of typhus and dysentery, but warnings were not weapons. Without lime, without disinfectant, without clean water, the war turned inward into the digestive tract, the bloodstream, the lungs. German medical units were already understaffed and overworked from combat injuries. Disease now arrived in waves larger than artillery barrages. Men weakened, then vanished into hospital tents that could not house them. Stench followed retreating units like fog. During the autumn of 1941, German units outside Moscow began reporting sickness rates that rivaled casualty figures. Diaries from infantrymen speak of men afraid to relieve themselves, of trousers stiff with frozen waist, of humiliation replacing pride. There were no replacements for dignity. Army doctors wrote reports requesting sanitation supplies. The requests were buried beneath fuel shortages and tank repairs. Command blamed climate. Climate blamed bacteria. And bacteria found their way into every trench, every shared spoon, every unwashed wound. By December, frostbite and disease became equal enemies. Yet disease was the one no one prepared for. Snow might stop tanks, but filth stops men. Latrine overflow weakened companies that had survived machine gun fire. Divisions that had conquered cities now could not hold positions not because of bullets, but because soldiers were too sick to walk, too dehydrated to aim, too ashamed to speak. The German war machine had been designed for movement and steel, not for waste and water. In that blind spot, the smallest missing item began claiming what artillery could not entire fighting units. And as winter tightened its grip and supplies vanished from the rail lines, German soldiers on the Eastern Front learned a cruel truth that victory did not depend solely on guns and orders, but on the unseen systems that kept a human body functioning in filth, cold, and war. By the beginning of 1942, the Eastern Front had become the largest uncontrolled medical crisis in modern warfare. The German army had entered the Soviet Union with approximately 3.8 million men. Within 6 months, hundreds of thousands were no longer fit for service, not only from combat wounds, but from disease. Medical reports from Army Group North, Centre and South showed a horrifying pattern. Dysentery, typhoid-like fevers, hepatitis, trench foot, and typhus spreading faster than reinforcements could arrive. In some divisions, more than 30% of personnel were recorded as sick at any given time. Units rotated not because of casualties from bullets, but because they could no longer stand. Entire companies ceased to function because too many men were unable to leave latrine pits. Typhus, spread by lice and filthy conditions, became a spectre that haunted camps and dugouts alike. It was not an immediate killer, it dripped through the ranks slowly, weakening men, swelling glands, igniting fever behind the eyes, clouding judgment. German medical officers wrote of soldiers wandering off at night, delirious, collapsing into snowdrifts, forgotten by morning. Field hospitals overflowed. Tent floors darkened not with blood, but with waste. Nurses and medics worked numb with cold and exhaustion, overseeing rows of men who had not eaten simply because eating caused pain. Medical units lacked basic antiseptics. Soap vanished from supply crates. Paper dressings were reused. Sterilization systems froze into useless steel blocks. For some, the front line was indistinguishable from the ward. The Soviets, retreating deeper into their own territory, left fields poisoned and wells destroyed. The scorched earth policy denied German troops access to clean water and habitable shelter. Every abandoned village became a diseased maze, barns crawling with lice, wells fouled with corpses, frozen beds soaked in sickness. Soldiers drank melted snow when water could not be found. Streams ran brown with waste from passing units. Dysentery followed wherever boots marched in clusters. The German army was trained for discipline and firepower, not for sanitation under annihilated infrastructure. War had erased the boundary between battlefield and cesspool. For German commanders, this was an invisible war. Staff maps showed arrows and positions, not infections and infestations. Officers riding heated command vehicles passed through plague zones without seeing them. Reports voicing sanitary collapse were classified under supply difficulties, a euphemism that masked catastrophe. Command chose not to dwell on something it could not quickly fix. In a war driven by ideology and speed, disease did not fit narratives of conquest. It was unheroic. Mathematical, slow, and therefore ignored. Across Army Group Center, winter retreat forced hundreds of thousands of men into cramped quarters never meant to house an army. Basements, cellars, barns, and tunnels were crammed with bodies. Lice spread person to person within days. Without fresh uniforms or washing facilities, parasites became permanent occupants. Medical directives ordered hair cutting and delousing whenever possible, but whenever possible no longer existed in a land of constant movement and enemy pressure. And paper? There was none for waste, none for cleaning, none for burns. Men wiped themselves with snow that froze skin raw. Some did not wipe at all, choosing infection over the pain of ice. Frostbite crept through weakened tissue. Open sores invited gangrene. Home front shortages compounded everything. Germany's paper production fell dramatically under bombing campaigns. Plants were destroyed. Wood pulp disappeared behind collapsing transport networks. Rationing lists in Berlin grew longer while supply convoys shrank. In field depots east of Smolensk, inventories show crates, once filled with sanitation goods, sitting empty by early 1942. No one could tell if requisitions were lost in transit or never sent at all. As fuel trains burned and locomotives lay twisted beneath bomb craters, deliveries that did arrive prioritized tanks, shells, and bread. No train commander would sacrifice a box of ammunition for soap. Within the ranks, something deeper began to crack. Letters home when paper could be found spoke of shame more than fear. Men wrote of becoming animals, of not recognizing themselves. Cleanliness, once ingrained into military routine, vanished. Beards grew wild. Hands blackened. Bodies were rarely washed. When someone died from illness, comrades did not flinch. They only hoped it would not be them next. Pride no longer came from victory. It came from surviving the night without sickness. By the end of winter, German troops understood what headquarters did not, that disease weakened an army faster than any assault. Men could fight while starving. Men could march while freezing. But when the body betrayed itself from the inside, there was nothing to command. Nothing to discipline. Nothing to punish. A rifle could be lifted by will. A body in revolt could not be ordered into obedience. And in the wreckage of failed logistics and ignored suffering, one simple absence paper for the most basic human need had become a frontline catastrophe, setting the stage for a collapse no general would ever officially admit. Angel won the soldier for the German infantryman. The war did not end at the edge of the trench. It followed him into the most private moments of survival. In frozen dugouts and blackened cellars, with no paper and no shelter, dignity evaporated faster than hope. Soldiers squatted behind ruined walls or dug shallow pits with bare hands, too weak to feel the cold through shredded gloves. Some waited until nightfall, not to avoid enemy patrols, but to avoid being seen by their own comrades. Diaries reveal men who starved themselves simply to avoid the pain of digestion. Others stopped drinking water entirely, choosing dehydration over dysentery. In the ranks of an army built on discipline and order, shame now spread faster than command. Rifle oil remained. Razor blades did not. Letters home described hunger and cold, but rarely what truly hollowed them out. The truth was unspeakable. In barracks without latrines, men slept beside their own waste. In the morning, boots were hard with ice that was not snow. The smell never faded. For many, survival was reduced to one daily prayer: get through today without sickness. And when that failed, they did not scream. They simply disappeared behind hospital canvas and were rarely seen again. Angle 2, the medical officer army doctors had sworn to save lives. On the Eastern Front, they could only count losses. By winter 1941, German medical officers were managing epidemics with no tools. Soap rationing turned hygiene into privilege. Sterilization units froze solid. Dressings were cut from old uniforms. Needles were boiled when few allowed. Paper dressings were reused until they fell apart. Field hospitals became waiting rooms for death, not from gunfire, but from fever and filth. Doctors wrote reports that were never answered. Some began falsifying paperwork just to keep extra supplies from being taken. Others begged commanders to evacuate units not because of Soviet pressure, but because disease was outpacing every cure. The most dangerous thing in a ward was no longer blood, it was contact. Typhus moved from stretcher to stretcher faster than nurses could isolate it. The lack of sanitation paper meant infected men were not cleaned. Sores were left open. Waste pooled beneath beds. A doctor could perform surgery in darkness, but he could not erase filth once it had soaked into flesh. Many physicians later described this period not as war medicine, but as medieval plague care. And through it all, they continued writing reports, knowing no train would bring what they needed in time. Angle 3, the quartermaster: if soldiers fought with rifles and doctors fought with bandages, quartermasters fought with numbers. And they were losing. By late 1941, German logistics officers were scrambling to supply an army that had outrun its own shadow. Trains were destroyed by bombers. Roads vanished beneath ice. Entire depots disappeared overnight under Soviet raids. Requests for sanitation goods were labeled non-essential. Requests for paper were often rejected entirely. The system prioritized killing capacity over survival systems. Ammunition was measurable. A disease outbreak was not. Quartermasters begged for space on trains already groaning under shells and fuel drums. They were told there was none. Some rewrote manifests to disguise soap as lubricant. Others hid medical supplies in ammunition crates. It rarely helped. The war demanded efficiency. Sanitation delivered nothing visible, and so it disappeared. In reports, quartermasters began describing divisions not in terms of strength, but in terms of sickness. Supply ledgers turned into death registries. Men were no longer deployed. They were replaced. And no one could ship paper fast enough to stop what was already unfolding inside the ranks. Angle 4, the command staff: from the warmth of command bunkers, the German High Command saw maps, not suffering. They saw arrows sweeping eastward. They saw numbers of divisions still listed as combat effective. What they did not see were the latrine pits frozen solid beneath barracks floors, the tent wards swelling with fever, the men quietly breaking down in filth. Reports from frontline doctors and quartermasters arrived daily, but they were filtered through layers of bureaucracy designed to preserve morale and image. No general wanted to sign a document stating that his division was being defeated by disease rather than by the Red Army. Institutional pride became policy. Field commanders minimized sanitation failures in official language, describing outbreaks as temporary health difficulties. Requests for hygiene equipment were labeled lower priority than artillery shells and tank parts. By the time some commanders realized the scale of collapse, it was already too late. To acknowledge the truth was to admit the war was being lost from the inside. And so command delayed, reissued slogans, and ordered offensives from desks that did not smell of rot. The men in trenches did not blame the Soviets for their illness. They blamed silence from above. The silence that told them their suffering was not strategic enough to count. Angle 5, the Soviet view: when Soviet troops recaptured villages once occupied by German units, what they found did not look like a victorious army's footsteps. They found camps rotten with waste, latrines overflowing into trenches, blankets crawling with lice. In winter relief reports, Red Army officers described abandoned German positions reeking of decay. Soviet propaganda seized on these scenes not to mock, but to reveal vulnerability. The Wehrmacht, presented as a machine of steel, was shown to be human after all. Disease-ridden, exhausted, fragile. Russian doctors examining captured German soldiers noted extreme malnutrition and advanced intestinal infections. In some cases, men surrendered not because they had been defeated in combat, but because they could no longer stand. Soviet commanders recognized something important. German troops were breaking not only under artillery fire, but under the weight of their own failing logistics. Targeting transport routes became more frequent. Not simply to starve the enemy, but to rot him. War had become a battle of supply endurance. And Germany, for the first time, was losing it. Angle 6. The moral reality war is rarely remembered in waste and sickness. It is remembered in heroics and flags and explosions. But beneath every victory lies the body vulnerable and relentlessly biological. The German army did not collapse from bullets alone. It collapsed because it forgot the anatomy of its own men. Hygiene was dismissed as unglamorous. Paper as trivial. Sanitation as afterthought. But war does not forgive biological neglect. Infection does not honor ideology. Dysentery does not pause for rank. What happened on the Eastern Front was not just a military failure, it was a human one. An army that could build tanks could not supply soap. A nation that could conquer cities could not maintain cleanliness. And men paid for that blindness inside their own bodies. The realization came too late, and when it did, an entire division was already teetering on the edge of disappearance. By February 1942, one German infantry division on the Eastern Front deployed south of Leningrad along frontier supply corridors, and half-cleared forests had begun to vanish without being defeated. On paper, it still existed. On maps, it still held ground. But in reality, it was dissolving from inside its own lines. Morning roll calls were quieter each day. Not because men were retreating, but because they were too sick to stand. More than a third of the division was already listed as medically unfit. Another third was under observation. Hospital tents had expanded into stables, into schools, into cellars lined with straw that reeked of rot. There were more stretchers than rifles. What crippled the unit was not a bullet, but a chain reaction. Rail deliveries had collapsed during the winter Soviet counteroffensive. Trains bypassed medical depots to deliver fuel to armored divisions further south. Hygiene supplies vanished entirely. Soap disappeared first. Bandages were rationed next. Then, water purification chemicals stopped arriving. Finally, paper coarse, brown field paper became a memory. Mutable necessities disappeared one by one until men could no longer perform the most basic human function with safety or privacy. Latrine pits, when they existed, were frozen. When they thawed, they leaked. Waste overflowed into living areas. Men relieved themselves wherever they could behind ruined walls, beneath staircases, beside burning wreckage. Flies somehow alive, even in winter, clustered near the mess areas. Rats moved unchecked. Typhus spread through clothing seams. Dysentery hollowed stomachs. Soldiers evacuated from the front did not scream from shrapnel wounds. They cried from dehydration and fever. The division's chief medical officer sent urgent memoranda requesting immediate evacuation of entire battalions. The replies came slowly. When they arrived, they offered nothing. No supplies. No transport. Only instructions. Hold the line. That phrase echoed through wards and trenches like mockery. Morale collapsed faster than troop numbers. The strongest men were no longer the most effective. Rank meant nothing in the face of disease. Colonels shared sleeping space with vomiting privates. Pride disintegrated in filth. No medals could stop diarrhea. No discipline could command hunger-induced delirium into silence. By the third week of February, the field hospital began turning men away. There were no beds left. No clean blankets. Some were left shaking outside in the snow until they stopped moving altogether. Not because they were beyond saving, but because there was nowhere to put them. In one company, only 16 men were deemed combat capable. Out more than 100, Machine guns sat unmanned. Mortars had crews that could not lift them. Orders were written by officers too weak to button coats. The division did not retreat. It simply stopped. A unit built for motion became motionless. And finally, silently, without battle, without proclamation, its fate was sealed in paperwork. The order did not come as a dramatic decree. There were no bugles, no final stand. It arrived the way all bureaucratic deaths arrive inside a folder, stamped in ink, buried beneath statistics. The division was designated not operational due to medical failure. In the language of war, that meant extinction. Transport trains, when they finally arrived, did not bring reinforcements. They carried evacuation tags. Not for the wounded, but for the sick. Train cars, once used for ammunition, now filled with bodies wrapped in thin blankets. Some men were delirious. Others were silent. Many had not cleaned themselves in weeks. Guards accompanying the transports were warned not to remove coats. Typhus did not care about rank. Entire companies were removed from the front in one night, but not replaced. New units did not arrive. They could not. The rail system was shattered. Trains burned outside of Smolensk and Bryansk. Partisan attacks increased. The Red Army hunted transport lines with the precision of a surgeon cutting arteries. The division's rear guard disintegrated under hunger and disease. Not even retreat was fully possible. The sick could not march. Horses collapsed. Trucks froze. Engines seized. Field commanders began burning documents. Medical personnel destroyed contaminated blankets and uniforms. Not from protocol, but in despair. Men threw letters into fires not because of espionage risk, but because paper had become more valuable as warmth than memory. Some tried to trade rifles for soap with nearby units. None had any. When Soviet forces advanced into sector boundaries once held by that division, they reported almost no resistance. Machine gun nests were empty. Trenches were silent. A war zone felt abandoned without being conquered. Soviet scouts walked through German positions expecting ambush, and instead found fevered men curled in corners, too weak to lift their hands. Some surrendered. Others did not react at all. The Red Army did not defeat the unit. It inherited its remains. Back in Germany, the division still existed in records. In reality, it no longer functioned. Not as a fighting unit. Not as a formation. Not even as a community. Men who returned home did not speak of battles. They spoke of never wanting to be dirty again. Of water. Of paper. Of warmth. Of privacy. The smallest comforts had become the most powerful memories. No headline ever announced the division's fall. No radio broadcast listed its end. There was no surrender ceremony. It simply ceased, erased not by artillery fire, but by the absence of things too ordinary to be named in war councils. And in that quiet disappearance, the German war machine learned its most expensive lesson. The collapse of that division did not echo through the war in explosions. It moved through corridors and briefings and hospital reports quietly, sickeningly slow, and impossible to reverse. Medical trains returned west, carrying disease with them. Typhus did not stop at the edge of battle maps. It rode rail cars, bled into depots, and seeped into replacement camps across occupied Europe. German field hospitals in Poland and East Prussia began quarantining entire wings. Some were too late. Medics fell ill beside their patients. Clerks stopped showing up for duty. Barracks were sealed from the inside. In Germany proper, the civilian population felt the tremor through absence. Men did not return from the front, but their stories did. Letters described filth, not glory. Disease, not victory. Families burned them after reading, fearing contamination through ink and paper. Hospitals at home braced for outbreaks. Posters warning of typhus appeared in train stations. Soap rationing grew tighter. The Reich attempted to hide the crisis, but disease does not obey censorship. Doctors knew. Nurses knew. Mothers whispered. Inside the Wehrmacht, something changed that no order could command. Quiet memos circulated. Medical officers were suddenly granted greater authority over unit fitness. Reports once ignored now found desks. Sanitation inspections became mandatory. Field manuals were edited. Emergency hygiene regimens were introduced: boiling water, delousing cycles, makeshift latrines. The army attempted to fix a machine after pieces had already shattered. Production quotas for medical paper and sanitation goods were raised, but factories could not catch up. Bombing raids erased output faster than it could be restored. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front grew more brutal. Disease rates did not fall, they spread. Retreating units left behind sickness like footprints in ash. Soviet counteroffensives cut deeper into supply arteries. Every rail line lost meant fewer medical convoys. Every bridge burned meant fewer lives saved. Reckoning arrived too late for thousands. Among survivors of that erased division, rehabilitation was long and uncertain. Men returned thinner. Haunted. Ashamed. Doctors reported irreversible damage to kidneys, intestines, nervous systems. Some never recovered control of their bodies. Others refused to speak of what happened inside hospital tents. They would talk about battles they were not in before they talked about sickness they survived. And across Europe, the lesson was written not in doctrine, but in graves. The German High Command never officially named disease and sanitation collapse as causes of strategic failure. Instead, reports framed defeats as whether miscalculations, logistical overextension, or enemy superiority. But within internal medical and supply assessments, a different story appeared, one written in infection rates, mortality charts, and admissions logs. Late war Wehrmacht medical records increasingly listed illness not as a secondary factor, but as an independent operational threat. Entire units were now classified not by morale or equipment, but by health status. Command began tracking disease the way it tracked fuel. By 1943, hygiene units were expanded on paper. Delousing stations followed retreating forces. Emergency sanitation doctrines were circulated. Mobile facilities were constructed. But the Reich was too hollowed out to implement them fully. Resources were exhausted. Production centers lay in ruins. Rail lines were under constant attack. The war had shifted from strategic maneuver into a frantic scramble to survive. What should have been fixed in 1941 was being discussed as doctrine in 1943, while defeat loomed across every front. The Allies, studying the Eastern Front from afar, drew their own conclusions. British and American military planners carefully analyzed German medical collapse. Sanitation, once treated as auxiliary, became central doctrine. Allied armies prioritized water purification kits, hygiene drills, and field latrine discipline. Entire units were trained not just to kill, but to stay clean. It was not mercy. It was survival mathematics. By Normandy, the Western Allies had mobile bathing systems, medical hygiene teams, and sanitation enforcement units embedded behind frontline divisions. Not out of compassion, but out of understanding learned from German failure. On the Soviet side, the lesson was harsh and immediate. Disease had ravaged both armies, but the Red Army increasingly integrated field hygiene into operational planning. Medical trains were armored. Quarantine zones enforced. The Soviets understood something Germany had refused to accept. No army can outrun biology. No ideology can overpower infection. After the war, veterans carried the truth home in silence. Medical archives were sealed. Public memory focused on battles, not hospitals. German post-war culture, heavy with guilt and devastation, rarely spoke of dysentery and filth. It did not fit heroic narratives nor moral reckonings. But doctors wrote it down. Epidemiologists traced outbreaks. Historians eventually followed the paper trail to a different kind of casualty list, one written not in gunfire deaths, but in infections left untreated. And slowly, the war's history rewrote itself. Victories re-examined, defeats reinterpreted. What had once been described as tactical collapse was now understood as systemic decay. An army does not fall in one explosion. It decomposes. What had begun as a shortage ended as a reckoning. War is remembered in noise, in thunder and flame and flags raised over ruins. But war is not sustained by sound. It is sustained by the body. And the body, fragile and unglorified, has needs no speech can control. On the Eastern Front, the German army learned that lesson too late, not through strategy, but through sickness. When rifles failed, men still stood. When cities burned, men still marched. But when the body broke from within, there was no command strong enough to restore it. The absence of something as small as paper did not merely inconvenience soldiers. It stripped them of dignity. It invited disease. It silenced divisions. It revealed that the true limit of empire is not the map, but the human body. Tanks can cross borders. Armies can level cities. But no power can negotiate with infection. No ideology can outmarch biology. History remembers generals. It lists battles and treaties. Rarely does it pause to honor those who died from invisible enemies beneath banners that promised greatness. Yet it is in these quiet deaths that the truest measure of war is found, not in how loudly nations fall, but in how silently men disappear. Today, no monument marks the latrine pits beneath the snow. No museum displays the letters burned for warmth or the blankets crawling with lice. But they mattered. They ended lives. They shaped strategy. They decided outcomes no weapon ever touched. And in that, they remind the world of something war never wants to admit, that its ultimate enemy is not always the man in the opposite uniform, but the vulnerability carried by every soldier beneath it.